Hello and welcome to Marketing Global Edition with me, Jasmine Montgomery. Something really exciting is happening today. The crew of the Artemis II are returning to Earth after their trip to the dark side of the moon. And we thought about making this a marketing in space story, like, Elon Musk sending his Tesla into outer space. Apparently, it continues its mission off into infinity. Some alien one day will find it and drive around thinking about Elon Musk and all us crazy humans. But in the meantime, I didn't think many of you listening would be contemplating marketing in space anytime soon. So I thought I would focus on the part of the Artemis story so far that has a distinctly relevant angle for brands here on Earth. Because something happened the other day that is a link to one of my favorite all-time campaigns. Because NASA shared some photos shot on the iPhone 17 Pro Max during Artemis II's mission to the moon. And I just love this story. Basically, Earth just took a selfie with the Orion spaceship as its selfie stick. And they were shot on an iPhone 17 Pro Max phone, and so add a new and extraordinary bit of content to iPhone's Shot on iPhone campaign, which is just such a great campaign. If you haven't seen the shots I'm talking about yet, look them up. The Earth is shown in the spacecraft window with a faint outline of an astronaut, actually two astronauts, looking at it. So early in the mission, Commander Reese Wiseman shot two of the photos looking out of the window with Earth behind him. And then mission specialist Christina Koch, with her wonderful floating curls in zero gravity, which I absolutely love. She's been such a great spokeswoman for this mission. She captured herself looking out sort of wistfully over our home planet Earth. And it's just absolutely incredible. All three shots were shot using the front selfie camera. And I was pretty surprised to learn, actually, that astronauts were allowed to bring iPhones on their mission. But apparently smartphones were cleared for use for the first time in February. Other devices made by Apple have gone up. iPads, headphones, iPods have gone into space, but not yet smartphones. But these images are absolutely fabulous. And it's the kind of publicity you just almost can't pay for or engineer. To be clear, all the reports do say that Apple didn't set this up. This is not product placement. This was organic, spontaneous. And interestingly, they haven't really been doing anything with the images. So I've had a look at, their feeds, their social feeds and their website and stuff. They haven't actually put it on their Shot on iPhone feed yet. Now, that may be for several reasons. One is these images belong to NASA. They are the intellectual property of NASA. Also, at the time of me broadcasting this, the mission isn't over yet. I pray that it will end successfully in the middle of the night tonight. But I wonder if we'll see reference to them somehow on Apple's feed when the astronauts are safely back on Earth. But in a way, Apple don't need to repost them or put them on a billboard because the whole world is already reposting them with the hashtag Shot on iPhone. And that's what's known in our world as earned media. In other words, it's about getting other people to talk about you rather than you paying to send a crafted ad out into the world. Which brings us to our topic for today. So I'm talking today about campaigns that are based on user-generated content, or UGC for short, campaigns like Shot on iPhone. So it's become one of the most effective ways to build credibility, but it's also one of the easiest things to really get wrong. I think quite a lot of it is done badly. A lot of brands treat it as sort of free content, or they over-engineer it and kind of strip out the very thing that makes it work. So I'm going to break down how it actually works when it's done properly, starting with Shot on iPhone from Apple, but also looking at some other brands like GoPro, Airbnb, Duolingo, with kind of the same underlying idea, but completely different execution. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about how you actually make it work, how you actually elicit this stuff, because that's where a lot of campaigns fall apart. So let's start with Shot on iPhone. The campaign has been going since 2015. On the surface, it's straightforward. Apple showcases photos and videos that were taken by users of its iPhone cameras, right? And we've probably all seen it. I've certainly seen it standing on the tube in London, on the Underground. There's always these lovely shot on iPhone, images. If you haven't seen it, by all means, go on to Instagram and have a look at iPhone, shot on iPhone. Amazing images. It replaces, the sort of photo shoot crafted by a production house visual, but it also kind of replaces the traditional product claim. What it does is it's about Apple, allowing people to actually use the product rather than just make a claim about the product and have that product stand up on its own. But the way that they do it isn't just about opening the floodgates, right? And just asking everybody for, sure, they ask the world to send them in, but they heavily, heavily curate the images that come to them. And they set the bar extremely high. They're selecting images that can sit on billboards globally and hold attention. So they are extremely fussy about what they pick. And luckily, there are some phenomenal content creators in the world. The branding is minimal. There's often just a line saying that it was shot on an iPhone, and it's incredibly restrained. And it's quite hard to get clients to agree to that kind of branding restraint. You've almost got to be Apple to agree to not have all kinds of product claims and price promotions and everything else on your ad. Pretty extraordinary. That kind of design discipline is really hard to achieve. But it's also interesting to look at kind of their participation model, because Apple doesn't aggressively ask people to submit content. They create a standard. People see what gets selected and they aim for it. It's aspirational rather than transactional. And when you layer in something like the Artemis II astronauts using an iPhone in space, it just extends the perceived capability of the product and it reframes the ceiling. If it works there, it works anywhere. But it still comes back to the same device that people have in their pockets, which is why it's so exciting. So it's about, expanding belief, in the brand, which is so cool. One might argue that it's easy for kind of content creator brands to do this. If you're a device brand that creates content. I'm going to talk about a couple examples of brands that don't do that, but there is one other example of a kind of essentially a camera brand, and that's GoPro, that does phenomenal UGC. But it's quite unusual because they are so much around high intensity environments, extreme sports activities, surfing, skiing, skydiving. People already want to capture those moments. There's a narrative in what they're shooting, as well as how they're shooting it, I think, which is quite different from Apple. So it means that, they're not sort of faking the behavior. It's capturing this behavior as it happens with real people and then systematizing it. GoPro have an always-on pipeline. So submissions are always coming in constantly. Internal teams are reviewing, and then content is going out daily. So it's not a campaign, it is infrastructure. They have incentive layers. They have like GoPro awards, challenges, financial rewards for selected content, which changes the quality of submissions. People try harder when there's something tangible at stake. And over time, you see patterns emerge. So you see like point of view footage, quick hooks, high energy edits, and people get really into these things. And those patterns become, if you like, the brand language, even though they're not explicitly dictated by the brand. So you have sort of users, if you like, creative directing the direction of the brand, which is really cool and exciting and interesting. However, final output is, of course, heavily edited. Compilations, highlight reels, etc., all go into, go through the GoPro lens, if you like, and through their team. So it brings us back to curation. The brands that get this right, yes, sure, the raw material is user generated, but the finished product is not raw. But, there is a risk that this model doesn't translate easily to other categories, right? So if your product doesn't produce visually interesting moments, this approach is harder to replicate, but by no means impossible. So there are a couple of other really interesting examples of this. I think Airbnb is a really useful contrast because the role of UGC for Airbnb is different. Here, it's not about spectacle, it's about decision-making. So Airbnb is very, very different to GoPro and Apple. Airbnb is about trust, identity, and lived experience, which seems to be a phrase that everybody needs to use now. But that fundamentally shapes kind of how their UGC works. So the core strategic problem that Airbnb solved, their challenge wasn't awareness, it was trust, right? why should I stay in a stranger's home? And UGC became the answer to that question. So instead of saying trust us, Airbnb showed us. They didn't say it, which is great with trust. You should just, if you find yourself saying trust in a campaign, rewrite. They showed us. They showed us real homes, real hosts, real guests having real experiences. And that shift from brand promise to kind of peer validation is the foundation of everything they do now. So user-generated content is, it's just so endemic to the brand. And it's embedded in the product, right? So like reviews, ratings, photos, that's what users decide, use to decide what to book. So that's incredibly powerful, probably more powerful than any campaign, right? It sits right at the point of conversion. But on social, they amplify guest content, real stays, real experiences. It might feel to somebody like that would create kind of visual inconsistency, but actually the consistency comes from the emotional tone. It's about relatability rather than visual impact. So campaigns like Live There, they had a campaign Live There, and another one Made Possible by Hosts. Those campaigns really kind of build narratives from the user experiences. So you see these lovely sort of, even though kind of TV ads, are a slideshow of a family or a couple's experience in an Airbnb set to some music, and it looks kind of low production values, and yet somehow inspirational, aspirational, has a very kind of Instagrammy vibe to it. It's very much about small moments, building kind of narratives out of small moments, much less dramatic than your average ad shot, through an ad agency, but really relevant to real people. They don't overstructure stuff. So there's hashtags, there's light prompts. It's a really broad range of content. They're very loose on control, but, they're great on authenticity. So more control means less authenticity. Less control means more variability. So it's a trade-off. The other one I wanted to mention, which is hilarious and so different, and this isn't really photography, this is a whole other thing, is Duolingo. And Duolingo is probably the most different of all the examples talking about today. It didn't start by asking for content. I don't think it even started trying to be user-generated in its content. It obviously has an incredibly funny social voice. So, as you probably know, Duolingo has this incredible owl, this mascot, this very meme-worthy mascot called Duo, who is a persistent, quite sort of homicidal, angry owl who, he's always angry at me because I've never done my lessons. Perhaps if you're doing your lessons, he's not angry, but mine is always on the verge of committing first-degree murder. And they've always kind of used this really funny mascot, which just spontaneously generated all of these incredible memes. People were going on social and making memes with the Duolingo mascot, the owl. And rather than trying to control or suppress any of that, Duolingo just leaned into the jokes and amplified them, which is just so clever of them. So Duolingo will find you, for example, is a phrase that stems from social media trends, highlighting Duo the owl's relentless commitment to preventing broken streaks and, kind of featuring his dark, humorous kind of voice. And people online started making their own memes. And Duolingo, instead of formalizing that into some sort of neat campaign, they just leaned into it. So they now produce content in the same style as the users, really short, really informal, totally platform native. They've really blurred the line between UGC and brand content. If you look at it, sometimes it's really hard to tell what their in-house team have done and what users have done. And then, of course, the mascot plays a big role. It gives them this character to build around. And, at the end of the day, Duolingo, I just think it's such a clever brand because it is a character, not a company. The owl is a meme, a personality, a narrative device. And this allows, storylines, running jokes, and audience participation. Even extreme campaigns like kind of killing the mascot, which they did at one point, they brought him back to life, but, drives massive engagement and conversation because people are really invested in this little owl. So the content is kind of designed to be remixed into kind of duets, stitches, responses, By the way, if you don't know what I'm talking about, those are all content formats on TikTok that allow users to remix content with brands, duets, side-by-side, panels in a video where you can be showing some content and commenting on it at the same time. And that's really where the scale comes from. So not just views, but participation. So they do run structured initiatives, challenges, creator collaborations, and so on. And they iterate really quickly. So formats that work get repeated. I guess the only risk is that you can end up drifting away from the product. So you can end up with really high engagement with your mascot, but weak linkage to what you're actually selling if you're not careful. So these are some really different models for user-generated content, but the underlying mechanics are essentially similar. So the real principles around UGC and what works, are you start with behavior. What are people already doing? Then you define participation. What exactly do you want them to create? Then incentives. Why would they do that? Then curation. What gets selected and amplified? And finally, distribution. How does it reach scale? And most campaigns fail to do some of those steps, usually the first one. So they often invent behavior instead of working with what exists. So what makes UGC work really well? There's, it needs to be designed. It doesn't just happen naturally. So it does need a kind of big idea behind it. It's usually more structured than people realize. Even when it looks loose, there's usually a format underneath. People don't create content just because a brand asks them to. There has to be something in it for them. And recognition's a really big one, visibility. Sometimes it's money, but sometimes it's just being associated with the brand. If you have a tremendous brand, people are very proud to be associated with it. But also curation. Raw content on its own is rarely enough. Somebody with taste, with visual acumen, with a really strong sense of the brand voice has to decide what gets amplified. And that's where quite a lot of brands often get uncomfortable, get it wrong. They either curate too little and quality drops, or it's too much and it starts to feel contrived. And then there's scale. One piece of content doesn't shift perception. Volume does. So a single video is just a video, but 100 videos on the same subject is a movement. But when it works, when UGC works, so, it's often framed as a cheaper way to make content. It's really not that, because you still need a team of people working out what works and what doesn't work. But when it works, it really changes how people perceive a brand because it comes from other people. It carries more weight than coming from the marketing team. It has enormous authenticity, but it means accepting that you're not in complete control. And that's why a lot of brands really struggle with it. Well, I hope you haven't been struggling to listen to this. Thanks for making it so far. That is it for today. Thank you for listening, and good luck to the crew of the Artemis II mission. So looking forward to hearing about your safe return to Earth, and hopefully someone will be there with an iPhone to capture the moment. Thank you so much. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Marketing Global Edition is sponsored by 𝐻𝐻𝐸, the ad generator for small businesses that serves you effective and affordable ads in seconds. And by 7 Brands, the international advertising and branding agency that has worked with clients around the world from Coca-Cola to Facebook.